We're continuing to talk about how we live in the Father's house, and we're going to start this week and continue through November talking about the subject of stewardship. Stewardship, the managing and developing of the resources that God has entrusted us with. The first principle of stewardship is that when it comes to our resources, we are stewards, not owners. When it comes to our resources, we are stewards, managers of them, not owners of them. And what we have to understand is when we approach this subject of stewardship, before we even talk about the activity of stewardship, we have to embrace stewardship as our identity. Let me say that again. Before we can look at stewardship as an activity, in other words, before we talk about, well, how do I go about being a steward? The very first principle here is we've got to embrace stewardship as my identity. I am a steward. Here's what we are created for. He created us in his image with a twofold purpose in life. The first is communion with him. The very first purpose for which we were created is that we might know him and that we might live in communion with him. The second purpose, very important, even though it's second, very important, is that he's called us, commissioned us to be stewards, meaning that we are to manage and develop the physical world that he's placed us in. Second principle for today, manage your resources from, not for, contentment. Here's what I mean. We are not called to manage the resources God has given us in order to find contentment, but from a position of contentment in our identity as image bearers who are stewards of God's resources. Where does contentment come from? It does come from two key ingredients: security and satisfaction. We are content when we feel secure and when we feel satisfied. And the problem with grounding our contentment in the resources of this world, material things, is that they only can satisfy and they can only provide security for a little while and in a little measure. So they only supply, they do, let's not pretend here, right, that material things don't give us some satisfaction and don't give us some sense of security. They do, but that the point is they're temporary and they only provide security and satisfaction in a small measure. And the problem is that if your source of contentment is temporary, your contentment will be temporary. Principle 3 is God does not micromanage his stewards. God does not micromanage his stewards. Stewards, listen, stewards of the Lord. Stewards are trusted decision makers. The stewards here in the story, they are not told everything they have to do. They're given a job, and then they are trusted to make wise decisions in order to accomplish that job that they're given. So that is true. And so there's this freedom to make decisions because the Lord has empowered you by his Spirit to make good decisions, wise decisions, God-glorifying decisions. The last principle for today, though, is that faithful managers, faithful stewards do not compete in the managing of their resources. Giving and managing our resources is not a competition. When the master evaluates them, he does not evaluate them in comparison with the others. It has nothing to do with what anybody else has done. It's about what are you doing with what God has placed in your hand. God is concerned with faithfulness because faithfulness is a hard issue. Performance is not a hard issue. Performance is an issue of competition, and that's not what it's about. It's about faithfulness. It's a hard issue.